When I signed up for an interview skills course, I never thought it would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had just graduated and was in that frantic phase of applying to jobs, doing everything I could to make myself a stronger candidate. A local career center offered free group sessions where we could practice interviews, build resumes, and learn professional etiquette. It sounded like exactly what I needed. The sessions were held in a quiet classroom at the local library every Thursday evening. The first time I attended, I arrived a little early, took a seat, and looked around. There were about a dozen people, most of them in their 20s and 30s, all chatting or waiting for the instructor. That's when I noticed John. He sat near the back, slightly hunched, wearing an oversized hoodie despite the warm weather. His face was expressionless, but something about him made me uneasy. His eyes were always moving, watching people, studying them. When our instructor, Mr. Harris, started class, John barely participated. But when he did speak, his voice was flat, emotionless, like he was mimicking normal conversation rather than actually engaging in it. I ignored him at first. I wasn't there to make friends. I just wanted to sharpen my interview skills and leave. But John had other plans. After class, I was packing up my things when I heard his voice behind me. "You did well tonight." I turned around. John stood uncomfortably close, his hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. Thanks," I said, stepping back. "You look familiar," he continued, tilting his head. "Do you go to the college nearby?" I shook my head. "No, I just graduated." He stared at me for a moment, like he was processing the information. "Oh, cool." Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and left. I brushed it off. He was awkward, sure, but harmless. I was wrong. The next week, I arrived at the library earlier than usual. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot. I walked inside, found a seat, and started reviewing my notes. Then I felt it. Someone watching me. I glanced up. John was already there, sitting a few rows back, staring at me. He didn't look away. An uncomfortable chill crawled up my spine. I quickly dropped my gaze and pretended to be absorbed in my papers. As the class started, I did my best to focus, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. When it was my turn to practice answering interview questions, I stood and walked to the front of the room. As I spoke, my eyes flickered over the group. John's expression had shifted. He wasn't just staring anymore. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Something else. Something wrong. I stumbled over my words, suddenly self-conscious. Why was he looking at me like that? I finished my answer as quickly as I could and sat down. I didn't look at him again for the rest of the night. After class, I hurried to my car. The parking lot was mostly empty, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. I was halfway to my car when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned. John was following me. I gripped my bag tighter and walked faster. My car was only a few feet away. If I could just get inside and lock the doors, I'd be fine. But as I reached for my door handle, he spoke. "You're really good at this stuff." I froze. He was right behind me. Thanks," I muttered, forcing a polite smile. He stepped closer. Too close. "We should practice together sometime." My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I think I'm good. Thanks, though." He didn't move. For a moment, we just stood there in the empty parking lot, his body blocking my car door. Then, finally, he took a step back. "Okay, see you next week." I got in my car, locked the doors, and sped out of there without looking back. I should have stopped going to the class, but I told myself I was overreacting. He was just socially awkward. Maybe he didn't realize how weird he was being. So I went back, and that's when things got worse. The following week, I had an evening study session at the library before class. I picked a secluded table near the back, pulled out my laptop, and got to work. About an hour in, I heard the chair across from me scrape against the floor. I looked up. John was sitting there. I hadn't seen him come in, hadn't heard him. He was just there. "Hey," he said. I forced a polite smile. "Hey." He didn't say anything else, just sat there, staring at me. I tried to focus on my work, but my hands were shaking. I could feel his gaze burning into me. Why was he just sitting there? Finally, I shut my laptop. "I have to go." As I stood, so did he. And when I walked to the elevator, he followed. I took out my phone and pretended to text someone. Maybe if he thought I was meeting someone, he'd leave. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped inside. So did John. I could barely breathe. The doors closed, trapping me in the small space with him. My pulse pounded as the elevator descended. Then, he leaned in, close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. "You smell nice," he whispered. The moment the doors opened, I ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, in the open air, where there were witnesses, lights, people. John didn't follow me this time. That was the last class I attended. The next day, I emailed Mr. Harris, telling him I wouldn't be coming back. I didn't mention John. I just said I was too busy. I avoided the library for weeks after that. Then, one evening, I got a Facebook friend request from John. I didn't accept it, but I didn't block him either. I wanted to see if he'd try to message me. He didn't. Instead, he started liking my old photos, ones from years ago. That's when I finally blocked him. And after that, nothing. It was like he vanished. To this day, I don't know what his deal was. Maybe he was just socially clueless. Or maybe he was something else entirely. Driving at night has never really bothered me. I know some people find it unnerving. The darkness, the isolation, the way the road stretches on forever. But I always found it peaceful. A chance to clear my head, listen to music, and enjoy the quiet. But that night changed everything. I had just finished a long shift at work, a late-night closing shift at the diner where I waitressed. My feet ached, my eyes were heavy, and all I wanted was to get home, shower, and sleep for 12 hours straight. The highway was empty, just endless asphalt stretching out under a pitch-black sky. The only sound was the low hum of my car's engine and the occasional chirp of my turn signal when I switched lanes. I had driven this route 100 times before, but something about that night felt different. The air felt heavier, the darkness outside my windows almost unnatural in how absolute it was. No cars ahead of me, no cars behind me. Just me, alone on an empty road. Then, in my rearview mirror, I saw it. Flashing red and blue lights. My stomach dropped. I wasn't speeding. My tags were up to date. I wasn't swerving, and I hadn't been drinking. So why was I being pulled over? I turned down my music, took a deep breath, and pulled onto the shoulder. The police car stopped behind me, headlights beaming into my mirror so brightly I had to squint. I reached for my glove compartment, my fingers brushing against my registration and insurance, but something in my gut twisted, a strange, unsettling feeling that made me pause. Something felt off. I checked my mirror again, waiting for the officer to approach, but he didn't. The car just sat there, lights flashing, engine running. I frowned. Usually, officers were quick to approach, flashlight in hand, already knocking on the window before you had a chance to collect yourself. I glanced at my phone. No service. Not unusual for this stretch of highway, but still, not great. After what felt like an eternity, the driver's side door of the police car finally opened. A man stepped out, and immediately, alarm bells went off in my head. He wasn't wearing a standard police uniform. Oh, he had a badge on his chest and a dark jacket that looked official enough. But the pants? Just regular black jeans. His boots looked scuffed and dirty, like he had been walking through mud. And his posture was all wrong. I've been pulled over before. Normal cops have a certain way of carrying themselves. Confident, professional, in control. This guy? He hesitated as he walked toward me, like he was nervous. I cracked my window an inch, enough to hear him, but not enough for him to reach inside. He stopped beside my door, one hand resting against the roof of my car. "License and registration," he said. Something about his voice sent a shiver down my spine. It was too casual, too flat, like he was trying to sound authoritative but didn't quite know how. I swallowed hard. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" His jaw tightened. "License and registration," he repeated. My fingers hovered over my wallet, but that gut feeling, the one screaming at me that something was very, very wrong, held me back. I glanced at his car. The police decals looked off. like they had been slapped on in a hurry, slightly crooked. The number on the side was faded, like it had been partially scrubbed off. That's when I noticed something else. There was no dashboard camera. Every cop car I had ever seen had one. This one didn't. A cold wave of fear washed over me. I forced myself to keep my voice steady. I'd be happy to provide my information, but I'd like to call dispatch to confirm this stop. His face twitched, just for a second, a flicker of irritation, maybe even panic, before he smoothed it over. "There's no need for that," he said. "Just hand over your license." My heart was pounding now. If he was a real cop, he wouldn't care if I called dispatch. In fact, he'd probably encourage it. I had two choices: comply and risk whatever this was, or push back and see what happened. I forced a tight-lipped smile. I'd really prefer to call. That's when his radio crackled. A garbled voice came through, fast and urgent. And just like that, his entire demeanor changed. He took a step back. His eyes darted to his car, then back to me. Then, without another word, he turned around, rushed to his car, and drove off. I sat there, shaking, breathless, completely stunned. For a moment, I just stared at the empty road ahead, trying to process what had just happened. Why did he leave so suddenly? Who was on the other end of that radio? Was there even anyone on the radio? I didn't stick around to find out. I pulled back onto the highway, driving way over the speed limit until I reached the nearest gas station. I parked under the bright lights, locked my doors, and finally let myself breathe. I pulled out my phone, still no service. It wasn't until I got home that I was able to check my tags. They weren't expired, not even close. I called the local police department the next day, told them everything. They had no record of an officer stopping someone in that area. No reports, no patrol cars assigned to that stretch of highway. And when I described the man, the officer on the other end went quiet. "We've had reports," he said finally, "people describing a similar situation, but we've never been able to catch him." That's when it really hit me. That man, whoever he was, wasn't a cop, and I had been seconds away from handing over my ID and possibly never being seen again. I don't drive at night anymore, and if I ever get pulled over again, you can bet I'll be calling 911 first before rolling down my window, because next time, I might not be so lucky. It was a normal afternoon, just another errand to check off my list. I had taken my son, Noah, to the grocery store after preschool to grab a few things for dinner. At 4 years old, he was a bundle of energy, constantly talking, pointing at things, and asking for snacks. It was a routine we had done 100 times before. Walk in, grab a cart, keep Noah entertained while I shopped. But that day, something was different, and it started with her. I first noticed her in the produce section. An older woman, probably in her late 60s, standing by the apples. She was staring at Noah, not in a casual, oh how cute kind of way. No, this was different. Her eyes were locked on him, her expression intense, unblinking. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was just an old woman who liked kids. Some people are like that, right? They see a little boy laughing and running around and feel nostalgic. But something about the way she was looking at him made me uneasy. I turned the cart down another aisle, trying to shake the weird feeling. But she followed us. I stopped in the cereal aisle, grabbing a box off the shelf while Noah pointed excitedly at some sugary brand I had no intention of buying. And then, there she was again. This time, she spoke. "He's such a handsome boy," she said, stepping closer. I forced a polite smile. "Thank you." She tilted her head. "How old is he?" "4," I said, reaching for another box and pretending to be distracted. "4," she murmured, as if tasting the word. Something in her tone sent a chill through me. I glanced down at Noah. He wasn't paying attention. He was too busy looking at the cereal boxes, completely unaware of the way this woman was staring at him. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "I have some clothes in my car that would fit him perfectly." My entire body tensed. It was so out of nowhere, so strangely specific. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. She smiled, unfazed. "I have a grandson about his age, but he outgrew his clothes too fast. I was just thinking, You could have them. They'd fit your little boy perfectly. Everything in me screamed that something was wrong. No, thank you, I said, gripping the cart a little tighter. She didn't drop the smile. Oh, it's no trouble. I'm parked right outside. She gestured toward the entrance, and for the first time, I realized she wasn't carrying a cart. She wasn't shopping. She was just wandering the aisles, watching. My heart started to race. No, we're fine, I said quickly. But thank you. I turned the cart and started walking away, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The rest of my shopping trip was pure paranoia. Every aisle I turned down, I kept looking over my shoulder. And every time, she was there. Not always close, but always nearby. I told myself I was overreacting, but my gut told me otherwise. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Near the frozen food section, she wasn't alone anymore. A man, mid-30s, dark jacket, cap pulled low, was standing near her, talking in low, hushed tones. Every few seconds, they both glanced in my direction. At me, at Noah, at my son. A heavy, sickening weight settled in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I abandoned half my shopping list and headed straight for checkout, keeping Noah close. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. I picked the fastest lane, my hands shaking as I loaded my items onto the belt. Then, as I went to pay, I saw her again, standing by the exit, waiting. Her hands were clasped together, her expression calm, patient. The man wasn't with her anymore. My throat was dry. I had to think fast. Hey, I said to the cashier, forcing a laugh. Can I get someone to help me out with my groceries? My hands are full with him. I motioned to Noah, who was still blissfully unaware of the situation. The cashier glanced at me, then at the woman near the door. Maybe she saw the look in my eyes, because she nodded immediately. Of course, she said. She called over a young employee, and I felt a wave of relief as he grabbed my bags and walked with me to the car. The woman was still standing near the exit as we walked out. But the moment she saw I wasn't alone, her expression changed. The smile vanished. She turned sharply and walked off toward the parking lot, disappearing between the rows of cars. I loaded Noah into the car as fast as I could, locking the doors the second we were inside. Then, gripping the wheel tightly, I scanned the parking lot. The woman was gone, and so was the man. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. The way she had followed us, the way she had stood by the exit, waiting, and the most unsettling thought of all. What if I had agreed to go with her? What if I had let her lead me to her car? What would have happened then? I never saw her again after that, but I changed the way I shopped. I stopped going to that store alone. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, trusting my instincts more. Because that day, something inside me knew that if I had made the wrong choice, if I had ignored the warning signs, I might not have made it home with my son. And that thought still haunts me. Ski trips were a tradition for me and my best friend, Aaron. Every winter, we would set aside a weekend, book a room at a small mountain lodge, and spend 2 days skiing, drinking hot chocolate, and escaping from the stress of school and work. That year, we found a great deal on a room at a hotel near the slopes. It wasn't a huge resort, just an older lodge nestled deep in the mountains. The reviews were mostly positive, though a few people mentioned that the place felt a little off. I didn't think much of it. I should have. We arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. The hotel lobby was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only people there. The woman at the front desk was polite but distracted, barely glancing up as she handed us our key cards. Room 309. We took the elevator up to the 3rd floor, rolling our bags down a long, dimly lit hallway. The carpet was old, the wallpaper slightly peeling at the edges. It smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and something else, something stale. The moment we stepped inside our room, Erin wrinkled her nose. "This place gives me weird vibes," she said, tossing her bag onto the bed. I laughed. It's just old. But truthfully, I felt it too. That strange, unnerving feeling, like we were being watched. After unpacking, we decided to grab dinner at the hotel restaurant downstairs. By the time we returned to our room, It was almost 10 p.m. The hallways were even quieter than before, the entire floor feeling eerily empty. We got ready for bed, exhausted from the long drive, and by 11 p.m., we had the lights off. That's when it started. A knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tapping. Tap, tap, tap. I frowned, sitting up in bed. Erin groaned from across the room. "What the hell?" she muttered. I glanced at the clock. 11:27 p.m. I got up and tiptoed toward the door, peering through the peephole. No one was there. A chill crawled up my spine. "That's weird." "What?" Erin asked sleepily. "No one's out there." She sat up, rubbing her eyes. Maybe someone knocked on the wrong door. I hesitated, still staring at the peephole. The hallway was completely empty. With a shrug, I stepped away from the door and climbed back into bed. And just as I pulled the covers up, tap, tap, tap. Louder this time. Erin and I froze. I turned to her. "That was our door." "Right." She nodded slowly, eyes wide. A creeping sense of dread settled in my chest. I slid out of bed again, my heart pounding, and approached the door as quietly as I could. This time, instead of looking through the peephole, I pressed my ear against the wood. Silence. Then, a sound. A faint, scraping noise, like someone dragging their fingernails down the doorframe. I took a step back, every instinct in me screaming that something was wrong. I motioned for Erin to be quiet, then reached for the doorknob and twisted the lock. For the next few minutes, we sat in silence, listening. Nothing. After a while, Erin sighed. "Maybe it was just some drunk guy." I nodded, though I wasn't convinced. Still, we eventually fell asleep, convincing ourselves it was just our imaginations. But when we woke up the next morning, something wasn't right. I was the first to get up. I stretched, yawned, and walked toward the door to grab my jacket off the hook. And that's when I noticed it. The peephole was covered, like someone had stuffed something inside it. A piece of tissue or fabric, blocking the view. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. "Erin," I said, my voice low. She sat up, still groggy. "What?" I pointed. She frowned, swinging her legs over the bed and walking over. She reached up, plucked the tiny wad of paper from the peephole, and let it fall to the floor. The hallway was visible again, empty, just like last night. Neither of us said anything for a long time. Finally, Erin whispered, "Someone was watching us." We spent the entire day on edge. Even out on the slopes, surrounded by fresh air and other skiers, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. That night, we double-checked the locks, pushed a chair against the door, and left the bathroom light on. But at exactly 2:48 a.m., I woke up, because I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up so fast my head spun. I turned to Erin. She was already awake, clutching the blanket, eyes wide. We didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the doorknob jiggled. I nearly screamed. Erin slapped a hand over her mouth, her whole body trembling. We watched, frozen, as the handle twisted slightly, left, right, left again, like someone was testing the lock. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Then, just like before, silence. We didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, we packed our bags faster than I thought possible. As we rolled our suitcases toward the elevator, we passed by the front desk. The woman from check-in was still there, looking just as tired as before. I hesitated, then walked up to her. "Hey," I said. "This might sound weird, but has anyone else reported strange things happening at night?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "Like knocking? Someone trying to get into rooms?" Her expression changed just slightly. A flicker of something. Concern? Recognition? Then she forced a polite smile. "Oh, I wouldn't worry about that." Her voice was too casual, too rehearsed. I wanted to ask more, but Erin grabbed my arm. "Let's go." So we left. Neither of us talked much on the drive home, but a few days later, curiosity got the best of me. I looked up the hotel again, and buried deep in the reviews, one I hadn't seen before, I found something that made my blood run cold. A woman wrote, "Stayed here last year. Woke up to someone knocking at my door in the middle of the night. Checked the peephole. There was a man standing there, wearing gloves. When I called the front desk, they said there was no one else on my floor. I didn't sleep for the rest of the trip. We never went back. I hadn't thought about Ryan in years. Back in college, he had been part of our group, charismatic, charming, always in the center of everything. He had a way of making people like him, of making you feel like he was your best friend, even if you barely knew him. At first, I thought he was just another guy trying too hard to be liked. But after everything that happened, I realized he wasn't just trying to be liked. He was trying to control people. It wasn't until he started dating Mia that we really saw who he was underneath all that charm. Mia was sweet, quiet, the kind of person who didn't like drama. She kept to herself, wasn't a partier, and didn't care about being in the spotlight. At first, it seemed like she and Ryan balanced each other out. He was social and outgoing, and she was reserved and thoughtful. But that balance didn't last. Slowly, Ryan's behavior changed. He became possessive. He'd always ask who she was talking to, what she was doing, where she was going. If she didn't respond to his texts fast enough, he'd start calling over and over until she answered. She brushed it off at first, said it was just because he cared about her, but we could all see it. It wasn't love, it was control. Then things got worse. One night, she went out with her roommates. Just dinner. No drinking, no clubbing, nothing wild. But when she got home, she had 30 missed calls from Ryan. 30. And when she finally called him back, he wasn't just angry, he was furious. He demanded to know why she hadn't invited him, why she was keeping secrets, why she was trying to make him look like a fool. That was the first time she called me crying, asking if I thought she was overreacting. I told her no. A few months later, she broke up with him. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. Ryan wouldn't let her go. He followed her to classes, waited for her outside of buildings, showed up at places he knew she'd be. If she talked to another guy, he'd start fights. If she ignored his texts, he'd show up at her dorm. And the worst part? He acted like he didn't see anything wrong with it. One night, she found out he had stolen her passwords, her email, her social media, even her bank account login. He claimed it was normal for couples to share everything, that she was being paranoid, that she should be grateful he cared enough to check on her. That's when she filed the restraining order. And just like that, Ryan disappeared. He transferred to another school, blocked by everyone who knew what had happened. After that, it was like he never existed. For a long time, I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 years later, I was in my last semester of college, completely focused on graduating and working full-time. One night, I got a Facebook message from a name I didn't recognize. The message was friendly, casual, like we had just spoken last week. "Hey man, throwing a party this weekend. A bunch of the old group will be there. You should stop by. I know it's been forever." I stared at the message, confused. The name didn't ring a bell, but the profile picture, it looked vaguely familiar. I scrolled through the account. No posts, no photos except for the profile picture. Nothing else. Something about it felt off. I responded, "Who all is coming?" Almost immediately, they sent back a list of names. People I hadn't seen in years. Some I hadn't even spoken to since freshman year. That made me hesitate. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was just some random old friend trying to get everyone together. The address was near campus. I figured I'd stop by for an hour, just long enough to say hi, then leave. That night, I drove to the address. It was a quiet house on the edge of town, past the main roads, where the streetlights were few and far between. When I pulled up, something immediately felt wrong. The house was completely dark. No music, no voices, no sign of a party. I checked my phone. Right address, right time. A feeling of unease settled in my gut. Where were the cars? The people? If it was a party, there should have been at least some noise. I sat in my car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A single light flickered on inside the house. Just for a second, then off again. My stomach twisted. I texted one of the names on the invite list, "Hey, you here yet?" No response. I texted another. Still nothing. The unease grew into something worse, something close to fear. I had two options: get out and check, or leave. I chose to leave. As I reversed out of the driveway, I felt like I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it. Someone standing in the dark, just out of sight. I didn't stop driving until I was halfway across town. The next morning, I checked Facebook. The account that had messaged me? Gone. Not just the messages, the entire profile. It had been completely erased, like it had never existed. A cold wave of realization hit me. I searched the address online. It wasn't a house. It was an abandoned property. It had been condemned years ago. I sat there, phone in hand, heartbeat thundering in my ears. Someone had tried to lure me there. Someone who knew our old college group. Someone who knew how to make it seem real. Then it hit me. Ryan. He had been gone for years. No contact, no sightings. But who else would do this? Who else would go through the effort of creating a fake account, gathering old names, and choosing a location where no one would ever find me? I stared at my screen, cold terror creeping up my spine. I had almost walked right into whatever trap he had set. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had gone inside, and I don't ever want to find out. When we first moved into the house, I was too young to notice anything strange. I was 7. My little sister Emily was 5, and to us, it was just a new place to play, a new backyard to run around in. The house was small but cozy, the kind of place that felt safe. At least, it should have. But there was one thing that never felt right. Our neighbor, Frank. Frank lived alone in the house next to ours, a small, run-down place with faded shutters and a lawn that was always overgrown. He was in his late 50s, maybe older, with thin white hair and a body that always seemed too still. At first, my parents were polite to him. They'd wave if they saw him outside, exchange small talk when they were getting the mail. He never said much back, just nodded, maybe mumbled something under his breath, then went back inside. But then we started noticing things. At night, his porch light would flicker on and off, like someone was flipping the switch over and over. Sometimes we'd hear his back door creak open in the middle of the night, even when there was no wind. And then there was the worst part. He watched us. Not in a casual, friendly way. Not in a curious neighbor way. Frank stared. From his window, from his porch, from the edge of his yard. He'd just stand there, motionless, his eyes locked onto our house. Watching. My parents brushed it off. "He's just old and lonely," my mom said. "He probably doesn't even realize he's doing it." But even then, I knew something was wrong. It was small things at first. I'd be playing outside and feel eyes on me. I'd turn, and there he'd be, standing behind his screen door, the faded mesh barely hiding his expressionless face. Emily and I would be riding our bikes down the street, and when we came back, he'd be in the exact same spot, standing in his window, watching us without blinking. It got to the point where we started playing in the backyard instead. But even there, I could feel it. One day, I looked up and saw him peeking through a gap in the wooden fence, his eyes just barely visible between the slats. I grabbed Emily's hand and raced inside. That was the first time I told my parents, but they didn't believe me. "He's just an old man," my dad said. "He's harmless." But he wasn't. Things escalated the summer I turned 12. Emily and I had just come home from the pool, still wrapped in towels, our hair wet with chlorine. My mom was inside cooking dinner, and my dad hadn't come home from work yet. We walked up the driveway, laughing about something dumb, when I saw it. Frank was standing at the end of our driveway, closer than ever before, just standing there, not moving, not saying anything, just watching us. Something about the way he was standing, his feet planted firmly, his shoulders stiff, made my stomach tighten. I nudged Emily. "Go inside." She frowned. "Why?" "Just go." Emily didn't argue. She ran up the steps and disappeared inside. I turned back. Frank hadn't moved. He just stood there, his gaze following Emily as she went inside. I forced myself to act normal, even though my heart was pounding. I gave a tight, forced smile. Hi, Mr. Frank." He didn't say anything, didn't even blink. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "She's a pretty little thing." I felt sick. I didn't say anything, just turned and ran inside, locking the door behind me. I told my mom everything. This time, she listened. That night, my dad went next door. He wasn't angry, but I could tell he was on edge. He told Frank to stay away from us. Frank didn't argue. He just stood in his doorway, staring, nodding slowly like he barely even heard what my dad was saying. And for a while, he did stay away. But the feeling never left. The feeling that he was still watching. Months passed. Winter came. The days were shorter, and it got dark earlier and earlier. Emily and I stayed inside more, partly because of the cold and partly because we just didn't want to be outside with Frank nearby. One night, we were watching TV in the living room when the power flickered. The house went dark for half a second, then came back. Probably just the wind, my mom said. I wasn't so sure. Something felt off. Emily fell asleep on the couch, curled up under a blanket. My parents were upstairs, already in bed. I decided to get some water before heading to my room. I walked into the kitchen, still groggy from lying down. I poured a glass, took a sip. Then I saw it, through the window above the sink. A dark shape standing in our backyard. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was a shadow, a tree, anything but what I thought it was. Then the shape moved, stepping forward, into the moonlight. Frank, standing in our backyard, looking right at me. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. He shouldn't be here. The fence was tall. He would have had to climb over it. I took a slow step back, barely breathing. Frank didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, like he had all the time in the world. I turned and ran upstairs to my parents' room, heart slamming against my ribs. I woke them up sobbing. By the time my dad got outside, Frank was gone. The next morning, my parents called the police. When they showed up at Frank's house, he didn't answer the door. The next day, he was gone. No sign of him. No furniture left in his house. It was like he had vanished overnight. No one knew where he went. No one ever saw him again. Years later, long after we had moved, I found myself thinking about Frank again. Curious, I searched his name online. There was almost nothing about him. No social media, no records, like he barely existed. But I did find one thing. A news article from 20 years before we moved into that house. It was about a missing girl, 5 years old, last seen near Frank's house. They never found her.